It has been a big few weeks for American politics. Assassination attempts, incumbents dropping out of the race, historically bad debate performances. It's been crazy. But not only has the last few weeks been a change, but so has the last 8 years. At least that's what some of YouTube's foremost American historians say. On the day Biden dropped out of the 2024 election, Professor Terry hosted fellow historians on a live stream where they said this.
Are we in a party shift right now?
I think so, yeah.
A new party system, yeah.
Now we can really feel it and see it. And
I think we're definitely in the midst of that. Yeah, probably 2016. We're going to look back and say is the beginning of a new party system.
I agree. So we're now in the 7th party system.
Yep.
But before we delve into if they're right or not, we have to first ask the question, what were the other 6 party systems? So in this video, we're going to go briefly over what the previous party systems were. We'll look at the key figures in each era, the key issues, the demographic breakdowns, and of course the evolution, shortcomings, and benefits of the two-party system that has dominated American political history. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's get into the video. So first things first, what is a party system? Basically, a party system is a political era in which the two given parties in the US have a certain relationship or characteristics. This can include which issues the parties contrast on, the demographic groups each party tends to attract, and of course, which parties are more prevalent. For example, the shift from the second to the third party system happened when the Whig Party disappeared and the Republican Party emerged to curb slavery, or when the fifth system changed to the sixth system when Republicans began to draw more votes from white Southerners in the 1960s and 70s. Like most historiographic measures, the first party system isn't the first way that government functioned in America. There were a couple systems before that, but since they weren't really two-party systems like we think of today with the modern constitution of the American government, they don't get counted. Still, I think it's important to understand those earlier systems a little bit, so let's go over those so we know what we're dealing with. I think a good place to start is actually the lead up to the Revolutionary War. This is what I would call party system -1. It's a direct outgrowth of the English system. The system had two parties, or two sides really, they weren't parties, and while it was often violent, especially during the war, it also had an element of political struggle. This was between the Patriots, sometimes even called the Whigs, referring to the English opposition party, and the Loyalists, usually called the Tories by the Patriots, and the Tories were kind of the dominant English pro-King party. The basic split was over whether or not to fight the American Revolutionary War and fight the English. In the lead up to the war, most Americans were on the same side and agreed that something had to be done about how they were being treated by England. However, during the war, people strongly disagreed on how to go about things. As we know, the Patriots wanted independence while the Tories wanted to stay with England, even if they wanted some reforms to some degree. In the early months of the war, people of both persuasions held political office, but Tories were often forced out or even imprisoned. The most famous example is William Franklin, the son of Benjamin Franklin, who was the English governor of New Jersey and disagreed strongly with his father on the question of independence even after the war. However, as we just said, this system was short-lived, as force and coercion became a significant factor in how these groups treated each other. Once the war was over, many Tories either left for England or even Canada, and obviously they had lost the war and thus had no real political or social capital. As the Tories lost power and influence, and as the question of independence was settled, new rifts started to emerge. At this time, there weren't distinct parties, we wouldn't even really get those until the 1800s, and the country had some unifying issues that more or less ensured some homogeneity in terms of ideology. This era, which roughly runs from 1776 to 96, was also not recognized as a party system. In general, the country was unified by a few things and was really just like a one or no party system. Initially, it was the war effort, then it was the collapsing American economy, then it was George Washington, who was extremely popular. That being said, there was some disagreement in this period. Mainly, it had to do with the power of the federal government, and this rift would get bigger after Washington left office. Basically, while the US had the Articles of Confederation, the states were very autonomous and the federal government had virtually no power. The states could make their own money, and the federal government had to print a crap ton of paper money to pay for the war effort, causing massive inflation. Plus, the federal government couldn't even tax the states. In short, the economy was horrendous, causing various issues after the war, from armed uprisings of unpaid veterans to the collapse of creditor income, which was how many of the founding fathers made their money. Eventually, enough people agreed that change was needed, leading to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The government then assumed the powers and separations it has today, but not everyone fully agreed yet. Some of this was for economic reasons, but there was also disagreement on the socio-political ramifications of giving the federal government too much power. Still, Washington kept the country unified, and his farewell address is one of the most famous in history, warning against partisanism, which he called factionalism. Still, those questions which we just saw continued after Washington, and without his unifying popularity, American politics split into two main factions. The first of these was the Federalists, which Washington likely was more politically similar to. The Federalists in general believed in a stronger federal government, hence their name. This included a strong treasury and national bank to regulate the economy, as well as a focus on commerce and trade. This also had a philosophical element, and many would-be Federalists before the Constitution had advocated for an executive role more similar to a monarchy. In both cases, a shining example is Alexander Hamilton. When it came to foreign affairs, the Federalists supported trade with England, something that had started under Washington with Jay's Treaty. At the time, the French Revolution was raging, which saw an end of the French monarchy and war with wider Europe. The Federalists saw the French Revolution as too radical, and most every country had to pick between France and the rest of Europe trade-wise, since there was constant war. This came up as a significant issue under John Adams, the first Federalist president. Under his administration, a quasi-war broke out between America and France on the high seas, a conflict that would kill hundreds, and to prevent being undermined at home, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which allowed him to deport foreigners and legally punish Americans who spoke out against his administration in favor of France. Adams also closed out his presidency by expanding and then appointing a series of federal circuit judges, increasing the power of the judiciary, while fellow Federalist John Marshall would establish judicial review in the Supreme Court, further increasing its power. As such, the Federalists tended to draw their support from Northerners, especially New Englanders, whose trade economy benefited from commerce and safe oceans. This was all contrasted by the other party, known variously as the Republicans, no, not those ones, the Democratic Republicans, or the Anti-Federalists. As if you couldn't tell by their name, they were less interested in a strong federal government, an issue that was especially common at the state level. Would-be anti-federalists, especially James Madison, were responsible for the Bill of Rights, which strengthened and codified the rights of the people against the government. Economically, they tended to oppose Hamilton's federal bank and the government's role in commerce. Thomas Jefferson was far and away the most famous anti-federalist, and his economic views in particular sought to keep America in an agrarian-based Yeoman economy. The Federalists also were more interested in supporting France over England, not necessarily for economic reasons, but because their revolution was seen as an echo of the American one. Demographically, the Anti-Federalists were more popular with lower-class farmers and immigrants, especially in the South, even if many of these people couldn't yet vote. All of this led to a very polarized time in American society. We won't go too deep into it today, but there were riots, libelous and hyper-partisan newspapers, fear of treason, borderline dictatorial presidents, attacks on journalists, even full-on rebellions that got the army sent in. It was a bad time, and probably worse than what goes on today. Still, like today, there were plenty of examples of politicians and parties seeming to go against their ideological beliefs, purposely or otherwise. Jefferson, for example, supported war with the Barbary pirates, who were attacking American Mediterranean trade despite the anti-federalist view of having a smaller or non-existent military. Later, James Madison, another anti-federalist, would also push for war even if it was against England, the anti-federalists' enemy. Jefferson also acted unilaterally and abused his power as president to buy the Louisiana Territory, a method that he would actually bemoan later. Further, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act of 1807, which was theoretically in line with his keeping America more neutral and economically agrarian, but ended up forcing America to industrialize and move away from the yeoman society Jefferson had envisioned. Anti-federalists generally began to move away from the idea of supporting France too, once the revolution was co-opted by Napoleon, who was a dictator. For their own part, the Federalists tended to be more factional, to the point that prominent Federalists, especially Hamilton, opposed Adams's re-election. Oh, that would be weird, people not supporting the incumbent president in their re-election. Sounds familiar. For Hamilton's taste, Adams was too soft on the French since he wanted to negotiate peace, and Adams also favored negotiation with the Barbary pirates rather than military engagement. In this first-party system, only one out-and-out Federalist became president, although it's fair to say Washington may have been one as well. The Anti-Federalists would control the presidency after 1800 through the collapse of the first-party system. And it's here we should talk quickly about why we have two-party systems in America instead of more diverse party systems like other parts of the world. The basic reason for this is that you have to win more than half of the vote, and it's hard to win more than half of the vote if there's more than two people running at the same time. It's pretty much impossible for three parties to be equally viable in an American election. There's also some people that argue that the two-party system helps to curb populism, as while it is less democratic, it essentially lets this group of established politicians keep out possible radicals. Although, again, that leads itself more to plutocracy and corruption at the higher levels of government. So anyway, how did this first party system end? A big reason was the 1812 War and the Hartford Convention. This is somewhat of an oversimplification, but here's roughly what happened. The 1812 War with England seemed like a lost cause to some, especially after the British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814. Plus, the commerce economy that relied on international trade was devastated by the war, something that was especially felt in New England, which was a Federalist stronghold. So in 1814, a bunch of Federalists got together in a secret meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, and discussed what to do about it. Some of them even advocated for secession, but they ended up just writing out a list of demands on how to change the Constitution, which would limit the power of the president since the last few presidents had been against Federalist ideas. But right after that happened, word arrived in America that peace was made and Jackson had won a great military victory down south. The war quickly became seen as a great victory for America, and something called the Era of Good Feelings arose, rife with patriotism and popularity for the Anti-Federalists who had won the war. So in short, the Federalists held some secret meetings and got very unpatriotic right before America became super patriotic, making them look really bad. Soon after, the Federalist Party essentially disappeared and we get into another no-party system, the Era of Good Feelings. With the ascendancy of James Monroe, originally an anti-federalist, political parties became a moot point, and he made a point of having a politically mixed government and trying to downplay partisanship. At the same time, the Napoleonic Wars in Europe ended, allowing America to have ties with both England and France, and the dangers of American foreign policy were over. There was strong unity in the country as America rose in the world as a power, but that wouldn't all last. It was under Monroe that the first major divides on the slavery issue would arise, namely with the Missouri Compromise. The issue would be a major fault line in America for the next 40 years, although interestingly, it wasn't the main dividing line between parties in this second party system, which arose after Monroe. The first of these parties was the Democrats, yes, those Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson. The Democrats were more populist than previous parties and had a strong voter base in the lower class, who were getting more and more enfranchisement through this period, and it was under Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, that all white men had the right to vote. But this lower class populist support came hand in hand with a stronger president who acted more authoritatively and upset the balance of power with the other branches of government. This was what the other party, the Whigs, feared. From America's inception, the Founding Fathers had been wary of democracy. Historically, democracies were co-opted by demagogues who would harness the masses against the established system and overthrow their opponents and the whole democratic system to become a dictator. As such, the founders opted for republicanism, which saw more balanced power and had a higher bar of participation for the populace. While Jackson was popular with the masses, they were concerned that he would ride that power to become dictatorial. Even the term Whig refers to the English political faction that we talked about earlier, which opposed the king's overreach of power, which was a strong motif in the anti-Jackson media. In short, the parties essentially split on the ideas of political power, with the Whigs drawing support from the old Federalist base of wealthier and middle-class people, and the Democrats tapping the newfound lower class, which began to get the right to vote. There were other differences as well, especially regarding the westward expansion of the country, which the Whigs saw as a way to increase the Democratic voter base and spread slavery. That being said, the Whigs didn't take a hard stance on the latter. The Democrats, by contrast, wanted to expand west, protect the institution of slavery on behalf of their mostly southern voter base, and also advocated for states' rights to that end. If you don't see the parallel, the Whigs were more similar to the Federalists and the Democrats to the Anti-Federalists of the previous system, although it's worth noting that even Jefferson, an Anti-Federalist, saw Jackson as a threat to America's Republican system. Both of these parties also ushered in more modern processes of the election, including party conventions, primaries, and the popularity of war heroes. This second party system lasted until 1856 and was mostly dominated by the Democrats. By the end of this era, the issue of slavery had heated up to a fever pitch, and the Whigs weren't consistent enough on their position to stand against the Democrats, who were solidly pro-slavery. This led to the creation of a new party, the Republican Party. Yes, those Republicans, who actually outperformed the Whigs in the three-way 1856 election. Once again, evidence that a three-way system just collapses two of the parties and makes one much more powerful, so it really makes sense to only run two-party systems the way American elections are done. More than the slavery issue, the Republicans were also pro-business, a trend that exists to this day, and as such their voter base was a mix of the middle and wealthy classes as well as abolitionists, overwhelmingly in the North initially. The Democrats continued their stranglehold on the Southern voting bloc. Obviously they weren't part of the election process during the Civil War, but they also drew on another lower class white group, immigrants. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, freed black men were able to vote and, unsurprisingly, voted heavily Republican. As such, the Republicans were dominant until 1876, at which point many people had had enough with the military occupation of the South, and the ensuing end of Reconstruction robbed black men of their right to vote in the South, returning the region back solidly to the Democrats. This third party system ushered in the same two parties we have today, and while the party names haven't shifted since, their bases and issues have. The third party system lasted until the tail end of the century, at which point a new challenger entered the arena, the Populists. By this point in American history, industrialization and expansion had led to the growth of a handful of extremely powerful, often cruel corporations. These big businesses had more or less captured both parties, and many people, especially in the poorer agrarian parts of the country, had had enough. More radical, populist parties arose, including the People's Party, as well as later even a socialist party. Advocating for a more democratic process, such as the election of senators, economic reforms more favorable to farmers like a progressive federal income tax and the ending of the gold standard, and workers' rights, these groups played significant roles in the American political sphere, ushering in the fourth party system. The Populists never won a presidential election, but they shook the game up in 1892, winning 5 western states and splitting their Republican vote. Again, showing you can't really have 3 people running for president because it just makes one person preeminent. Showing their importance as a voting bloc, both parties sought to court the Populists, including some of their platform into their own policies. Over time, the People's Party faded as their preferred candidate in subsequent elections. William Jennings Bryan, who was a Democrat, lost to back-to-back elections, and the economy improved, ebbing at the discontent the populists were based on. But their demands were often fulfilled with time, albeit by the two main parties. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, instituted Labor Day in 1894. Two Republican presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft, fought for workers' rights and busted large monopolies. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, ushered in a slew of reforms, both social and economic. In 1913, both federal income tax and direct voting of senators became amendments to the Constitution. 3 years later, the Adamson Act ushered in the 8-hour workday, and in 1919 and 1920, two more grassroots movements, the prohibition of alcohol and the right of women to vote, also became part of the Constitution. Foreign policy was rather divisive in this time period as America began to expand as an imperial power and briefly dipped its toe into European affairs. Foreign intervention occurred both under Republicans, namely the Spanish-American War and Philippine Wars, as well as Democrats, namely in World War I and the Russian intervention. This era, like the previous one, was dominated by Republicans who won 7 of the 10 presidential elections. The fourth party system continued for the next decade when 3 Republican presidents saw the era out, with the Roaring Twenties and the start of the Great Depression. But while the progressive character of the system ebbed in its last decade, the demographics generally stayed the same, with Southern whites and immigrants voting Democrat, while upper and middle class people, especially in the North, tended to vote Republican. While Roosevelt and Taft had been more progressive, the Democrats were more consistent in leading these progressive efforts, increasingly making it the party of the working classes. Black people through this system were thoroughly disenfranchised as a result of the Southern Democrat Jim Crow policies, but with time, the Republican commitment to helping them began to wane, opening the door for party change in the future. This all leads us to the fifth party system, which starts in 1932 with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Great Depression and the failure of Republicans to do anything about it led to the drastic decrease in their popularity. The gradual incorporation of populism into the Democratic platform had come to fruition. The New Deal economic policies greatly expanded the power and scope of the federal government, and many new organizations were created to try and ease the suffering of regular people, including national projects that employed many people and stronger regulation and price controlling. Additionally, FDR's overtures to racial equality, even if it didn't actually result in any policy, started to win black voters over, and when they were able to vote, they started to vote more and more Democrat. Pretty much, the Democrats now had a coalition of lower-class whites, immigrants, black people, as well as many middle-class intellectual types, i.e. pretty much everyone except the upper and middle-class white people. This massive voter bloc, coupled with the outbreak of World War II, ensured FDR solidly won 4 elections, half of the runtime of the fifth party system. Besides the New Deal, another massive issue of this time was foreign policy. Famously, FDR wanted to enter World War II much earlier, but the Republicans were staunchly opposed to it, as were leftist groups in America who had sympathy with the USSR, who was aligned with Germany for the early part of the war before America got involved. With Pearl Harbor, everyone changed their tune, and through the war and after, both parties were solidly in favor of American foreign intervention. The Democratic Truman instituted America's containment policy against communism, leading to the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Even Eisenhower, the fifth party system's lone Republican, oversaw some of America's most notorious coups, namely in Guatemala and Iran, although notably, he and his successor Kennedy had reservations about the military-industrial complex and how it could negatively affect American policy. That's not to say that American society writ large was pro-war, as left-wing movements were extremely vocal in the 60s about ending American involvement in Vietnam. Still, these left-wing movements didn't get much representation in government, and were often repressed by right-wing individuals in America, including J. Edgar Hoover, Joe McCarthy, and later Richard Nixon. The right tended to be more in favor of intervention during this period, even though it didn't have the same presidential presence, largely since they viewed communism as a greater threat than the left did. That being said, the Republicans only won 2 presidential elections during this time, both by Eisenhower. The most divisive issue during this time was race. Both Democratic and Republican presidents in this time did things to support black rights, but on the local level, things tended to stay the same until the end of the fifth party system. As before, white Southerners overwhelmingly voted Democrat, and it was Democratic politicians on the state level that instituted Jim Crow laws and opposed civil rights. Truman, a Democrat, had desegregated the military, and Eisenhower, a Republican, sent the 101st Airborne to ensure black students in Arkansas could attend desegregated schools safely. But it wasn't until Lyndon B. Johnson, a Democrat, that the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 was signed, and it's after this that one of the most contentious concepts in American political history begins. Let's start by taking a look at the presidential electoral map. As you know, the Democrats have been winning the South pretty much forever, but especially since the 1870s, and even with a very popular Republican like Eisenhower, the South still tended to vote blue. But in 1964, in the wake of the Civil Rights Act, we see this. The most staunchly Democratic states suddenly vote Republican against an overwhelmingly popular Democrat. This 64 election is largely attributable to the Republican candidate, Barry Goldwater, opposing the Civil Rights Act. Not because he was personally against it, but because he felt it was unconstitutional. And of course, these southern states also opposed the Civil Rights Act, although generally for far more nefarious reasons. We see another interesting result in 1968 when a third-party candidate, George Wallace, ran on the platform of restoring segregation. Lo and behold, he won the southern states. We see the South vote red again with Nixon in 1972, although to be fair, Nixon was just super popular across the board in the whole country, and even won the home state of his political opponent. 76 sees the South cut back to voting blue again, but the very popular Reagan wins the South again in 80 and 84. It's also worth noting that while the presidential elections do paint a stark picture, the congressional map isn't so cut and dry, and Republican Congress people don't start winning the South solidly until the 1990s. Again, this is one of the more contentious parts of American political history, and the implication could be pretty rough. As such, many Republicans like to attribute the shift into this sixth party system to factors outside of race, and the Democrats often do the opposite. If my personal opinion is worth anything, I think it's fair to say that the initial effect of the civil rights movement prompted many white people in the South to become single-issue voters against it, as seen with the 64 and 68 elections. However, I think the impact of that began to fade with time, as shown by congressional maps over the next 30 years still being a blue South, and I think the extreme popularity of Nixon and Reagan also makes it seem like the South switched red when in those cases it may have just been confounding variables of strong candidates. By the time we get to the 90s, I think other factors like NAFTA and the shift of blue-collar jobs to other countries began to play a bigger role in the voting changes. All in all, I suggest you do your own research if you're interested. I'm definitely not going to, settle the question here. Even Crash Course didn't want to touch the issue. Another big shift happens during this time, and that's the homogenization of the political parties. Throughout American history, the political parties tended to have a diverse cross-section, even if there were a few key issues that unified them. There were Whigs that supported and opposed slavery, there were Democrats that supported and opposed prohibition, there were Republicans that supported and opposed gun rights, and on and on. But around the 70s, and many people attribute this to the 1972 Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, social issues began to feature more heavily in party platforms, shrinking the allowed diversity of thought within the parties. The Republicans, who had previously been more concerned about economic matters, began to stump more strongly for the pro-life position, and the Democrats followed a similar pattern. This is another contentious part of American history as well, so again, please do your own research, but essentially we start to see a rise in the religious right, which incorporates social issues around reproductive issues, marriage, and general social conservatism into the Republicans, who had previously been more socially diverse, which also caused an opposite reaction from the Democrats. That being said, this is all another complex issue, and we can see that while the religious right tends to become more vocal in the 70s, again, the South, which is more religious, does not shift solidly right until 20 years later in the 90s, and many people attribute this to Newt Gingrich. It's complicated. Anyways, this sixth party system is characterized by a shift in voting demographics, namely with lower class whites starting to vote Republican not only in the South, but also Middle America. Plus, The once diverse parties began to become more homogenous and rigid, making it hard to find politicians that have a less ideological mix of policy beliefs. Since the parties are more rigid, in this sixth party system, it may also have become more difficult for one to be more dominant with time, since one party has a harder time offering up someone who can respond to a populace that has a shifting and sometimes contradictory concern. This is shown with a much more split 7-6 in presidential elections since 1964, far and away the most even party system, and that's pretty much how we get the political system that we're used to today. So all this comes back to what we talked about with the beginning of the video, a potential seventh party system that arose in 2016. I'll let Mr. Beat say his piece.
So we're now in the seventh party system.
Yep.
Which is basically, I think it's a new era of populism, for lack of a better word. I know that word is kind of like means different things to different people, but I think generally we've seen on both the left end of the spectrum and right end of the spectrum, the voices that are the loudest, that are the most influential, are the ones that say, we are fed up with the elites, we are fed up with the status quo, let's change a bunch of stuff.
So this potential new system carries over many things from the sixth party system, including the rigidity of party politics, as well as most economic and social stances. But notably, there is a rise in populism, especially on the right, which views the established system as corrupt and fundamentally working against the interests of average people, similar to the view of the People's Party in the late 1800s. Although it's too early to say, there may even be a demographic shift, with racial minorities increasingly voting Republican and eroding the racial stigma the party has had for decades. But in my opinion, the biggest potential change is this: foreign policy. Pretty much since the beginning of the fifth party system, foreign policy has been pretty bipartisan, even if there are significant elements in the American public that dissent. Afghanistan was bipartisan, Iraq was bipartisan, the world wars were bipartisan once the votes came to the floor, containment was bipartisan, Vietnam and its fall in popularity was bipartisan, even if some shenanigans by Nixon made it seem different towards the end. The Spanish-American War was bipartisan. By the time we get to single-party support for wars, we're back in early American history. The first party system saw pro-British Federalists against pro-French anti-Federalists, with the anti-Federalists also tending towards isolationism. To a lesser degree, the second party system saw pro-expansion Democrats against anti-expansion Whigs. The third party system saw pro-peace Democrats against pro-union Republicans, although obviously most of the Democratic electoral base was not part of the country by this point. But since then, the US government is often quite unified on what to do with wars, and the Trump years have shown the beginning of an end to that, even if the rhetoric and actions don't always match up. For example, Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, a more isolationist move, and Trump escalated tensions with Iran by striking Soleimani, a more interventionist one. Still though, the Democrats now have a more foreign-related policy with support for the Ukraine war and maintaining a presence in the Middle East, while Republicans oppose this to a significant degree, although notably support for Israel is still bipartisan. In 1920, the US was sick of foreign intervention by a Democratic president and elected a Republican to drag us back to domestic shores. In 2016, one can argue that a similar process began, and it may happen again in 2024. So what takeaways can we get from this overview of US political history? Well, for one, there has always been division in America. The Adams presidency was far more contentious than Trump's, as was Johnson's, Wilson's, other Johnsons, and all the compromisers. Another point is that things ebb and flow. While these periods of polarization exist, so do periods of unity. The era of good feelings, World War II, George Washington, the landslide elections of Nixon and Reagan. And even in periods where we aren't unified, there is often civility, as shown by most of the 20th century and early 21st century. Thirdly, I would say that modern changes in the potential seventh party system are most similar to the first party system. There is a stark divide on foreign policy, There's vitriolic language, questions of the solidity of the democratic process, changes in the Supreme Court, opposition towards an incumbent president by his own party. That being said, I think the populist angle is more similar to the third-party system. In short, I'm not sure that what we're seeing now is totally unique in American history, even if the specific combination of factors may be. And fourth, just to look at the scores, here are the lists of the least and most successful parties in American history. In short, everyone go vote, get involved, and especially locally, learn about the issues, both the ones that are important to you and the ones that aren't. Talk with people who disagree with you, especially in person, and listen to what they have to say. Not every political discussion has to be a debate, and sometimes it's just good to listen even if you disagree with them. I think another lesson we can take from looking at our political history is that it's been a lot worse. I don't think America is gonna collapse with either of these candidates. To quote David McCullough, one of the great American historians, "A sense of history is an antidote to self-pity and self-importance. To a large degree, history is a lesson in proportions. History reminds us that nothing counterfeit has any staying power." So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you have a great day. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.